Please, microphone goes to you.
Thank you, Richard, Madam Ombudsman, Madam Vladimir, Chairman of the Committee on Law Enforcement, Madam Zulsuk Kirchhoffner, Deputy Minister of Education, Madam Omorovna, Deputy Ombudsman, Ms. Gomenda, OHCHR Regional Representative for Central Asia, distinguished experts, representatives, and participants, ladies and gentlemen, дамы и господа. Bonjour, добрый день, Sanat Serbik, and in sign language. First, let me say that I am honored by the invitation to be the first speaker at the roundtable on respect for the right of people with hearing disabilities to education. I'd like to express my gratitude to the Ministry of Education, the Office of the Ombudsman for the Republic of Kyrgyzstan, and the Regional Office of the OHCHR for Central Asia for this privilege. I will be very brief because I will be speaking later, but I wish you all a rich and fruitful discussion and conclusions on how best to achieve in Kyrgyzstan the human rights of people with hearing disabilities to education, and I look forward to sharing with you much more when I have the immense privilege of addressing you again in a few minutes on this topic for this roundtable's opening presentation. So congratulations once again on this significant initiative. I will now return the floor to the chair, Mr. Gomenda, of this roundtable, because I will be speaking very shortly to you in much greater detail. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Спасибо большое. Я сейчас хочу дать слово моей коллеге Юлии, который будет вести это мероприятие. Я, к сожалению, у меня другая встреча и не нужно уйти. Еще раз всего хорошего, удачного мероприятия и удачных результатов этого мероприятия. Спасибо.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники круглого стола. Позвольте представиться. Меня зовут Юлия Воцлава. Я работаю координатором национальных программ Офиса ООН по правам человека. И позвольте еще раз от имени нашего офиса поблагодарить всех вас за участие. Данное мероприятие мы считаем уникальным тем, что идея мероприятия, она пришла из самого сообщества людей, глухих и слабослышащих. Вы можете здесь увидеть баннер. УКПЧ реализовывает школу по адвокации для молодых людей с инвалидностью. У нас есть 4 молодых участника, 2 девушки, 2 парня, которые сами окончили школы для глухих людей, для детей, для слабослышащих. Это была их идея поднять вопрос доступа к образованию. И УКПЧ ООН совместно с Институтом Омбудсмена поддержал эту идею. Поэтому мы очень ценим присутствие каждого из вас. Мы действительно рассматриваем данное мероприятие как площадку для конструктивного диалога, для поиска каких-то решений, для того, чтобы ситуация с доступом к образованию улучшалась. Я с радостью передам слово господину Фернандо Варен, но единственное хотела сказать 2 слова о нем. Вы можете читать в программе, что его позиция называется «Специальный докладчик ООН по правам меньшинств». Это специальные докладчики ООН, это ценные эксперты, ценнейшие эксперты, которые работают по своим тематикам. И мнение господина Фернандо Варена особенно ценно сегодня для нас, так как в 2019 году, в декабре, он был с официальным визитом в Кыргызской республике. Он встречался с представителями госорганов, с представителями гражданского общества. У него действительно есть личное понимание ситуации в Кыргызской республике. Мы благодарим его за участие. Он находится в Канаде, у него только 4:30 утра. Мы очень ценим то, что вы нашли время для того, чтобы присоединиться к нашему круглому столу. Спасибо вам большое, и вам слово.
Many thanks, Yulia. Again, I would like to acknowledge the honor of being invited by the Ministry of Education, the Office of the Ombudsman, and the Regional Office of the OHCHR for Central Asia for the honor of being your first speaker for this roundtable. I also wanted to express my appreciation in being allowed to join all of you in Kyrgyzstan, even if it is only virtually, because, as it was just mentioned by Yulia, and some of you will know of my association with Kyrgyzstan, which goes back actually much further than my contribution in the country in 2019. But it actually goes back, well, almost 2 decades earlier, to when the first OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, Ambassador Max van der Stoel, a good friend of Kyrgyzstan, an exceptional diplomat and statesman, held some of his first international conferences here. At one point, I participated, as I said many years ago, in some of those meetings. Before I begin, in a sense, I want to share with you a little story. In 2019, so a few years ago, at the 8th World Congress of the World Federation of the Deaf and Hard of Hearing in Paris, before COVID, I spoke on the significance of the linguistic rights as human rights for sign language. One of the events at the World Conference was a play, a theater, with dancing and acting by deaf people, deaf persons who were using sign language. And those of us who did not know sign language had simultaneous interpretation. I'll have to be honest, I was very surprised and deeply moved. It was a wonderful story. It was an extremely lively and expressive play with hand gestures, body movements, and facial expressions that carried a great deal of emotions. And all of it was using sign language. This was for me almost a revelation that sign languages were real languages, deeply expressive and human, even though intellectually, of course, I knew that sign languages had to be regarded as full languages. And as you may know, there are different sign languages around the world. Think around the world. And just as with other languages, they have their own varieties, identities, and even cultures, even slang expressions. For example, only used by young people. But to be more scientific, sign languages are considered to be natural human languages and linguistically equal to spoken. My story, I hope, permits us to understand better that the reason, one of the main reasons my mandate and in almost all of my activities, including contributions, including the contribution which I am starting in the United States, all of these activities raise the issue of deaf people, not as a matter of disability, but as a matter of human rights, and the human rights of a linguistic minority. This is because, since sign languages are natural languages, it means that in countries such as the United States and Kyrgyzstan, the users of sign languages are members of linguistic minorities from an objective, scientific, and legal point of view. Individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing, as well as members of their families and others who use sign languages to communicate, are using a full-fledged natural language. They are therefore members of linguistic minorities, falling within my mandate as a social project. And this was made officially, was verified officially, in my 2019 annual report to the United Nations General Assembly on the concept of a minority. And the next year, 2020, in my report to the General Assembly again on the significance and scope of the 4 categories of minorities in international human rights law. Deaf people who use sign language have certain human rights as members of a linguistic minority and as individuals. But mainly set out in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And I wanted to take this opportunity to commend, again, the important acknowledgement and acceptance of these legal obligations, which occurred when Kyrgyzstan ratified this treaty a few years ago. Kyrgyzstan has to be congratulated for this important gesture. Many of you will also know that it is Article 24 of that treaty, that convention, that sets out the rights of deaf people in the area of education, verifying, for example, that states must, amongst others, facilitate the learning of sign language and the promotion of the linguistic identity of the deaf community. States must also ensure that the education of persons, and in particular children who are deaf, is delivered in the most appropriate languages and modes and means of communication for the individual. I'll explain that. And that states must ensure that there are environments which maximize academic and social development. This convention also adds that states must adopt measures to employ teachers who are qualified in sign language. And it makes clear that states must ensure that persons with disabilities are able to access general, tertiary, and other forms of education without discrimination and on an equal basis by applying the principle of reasonable accommodation. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's important to point out that what this legal document proposes and what the government of Kyrgyzstan is committed to implement involve applying the right to education in conformity with the right to education without discrimination, and which means often in practice having in place reasonable forms of accommodation for individuals who are different, such as deaf people, and partly because they have disabilities, but also because they are users of sign language, having a different language which must be used and accommodated in certain contexts. To put it in terms of education and teaching, deaf children have a right to a quality education. I repeat this. Deaf children have a right to quality education, like all other children, in a language and environment that maximizes their potential. And what is also extremely important to understand is that it is now well understood that sign language is for many children, many deaf children, from a pedagogical point of view, from teaching and learning point of view, one of the best mediums of communication and instruction for them. Unfortunately, there is often, or sometimes, in the public, but also in government departments in some countries, misconceptions about sign languages and its effect on the development of deaf or partly deaf children. Let me be clear. Being taught in sign language does not, I repeat, does not interfere with learning spoken languages. Studies show that forcing deaf children to only learn a spoken language or on relying on technologies such as cochlear implants to try to make deaf children hear sign language instead of having them learn sign languages. This has clearly been shown by studies to delay actually having a negative effect on effective language learning. To put it differently, children who learn sign language soon after birth learn spoken language better. And this is one of the most important aspects in considering how to approach and understand the rights of deaf and hard of hearing children in education. What is in the best interest of these children? more likely to not leave them behind and to achieve the UN Social Development Goal, SDG Goal 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And perhaps especially, what do the right to quality education, which complies with the fundamental requirements of equality without discrimination, mean in relation to the language of learning and education of their children? And the answers are, to a large degree, in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's the answer that we find under Article 24, which sets out, which indicates that sign language must be used to the extent possible in education so that children can learn more easily, get better academic results, and are more likely to progress to the fullest of their potential. Those working with them in schools and other supporting staff services and resources in key areas such as health, media, public media, and the legal system all need to also reflect this, but is in fact a human right, the right to equality without discrimination and unfairness. And connected to all this also is that states must give opportunities to others that are connected to the full development of children, such as parents and support staff. They must also have the opportunity of learning sign language. So let me be clear. All of this is not required because these persons are disabled. It's more than that. It is because they are equal human rights in dignity and rights. They are equal human beings in dignity. In practice, the implementation of the concept of equality without discrimination in education means that their dignity and rights require the use and teaching of sign language as outlined in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. That's the explanation that you also find in all of the first 4 paragraphs of the preamble of the Convention on the Rights of Disabled Persons, which reminds us, and I quote, that the inherent dignity and worth and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, that everyone is entitled to all rights and freedoms without distinction, and of the need for persons with disabilities to be guaranteed their full enjoyment without discrimination. That's why this round table has the title, Respect for the Right of People with Hearing Disabilities to Education. And the organizers must be congratulated, must be commended for having so well captured the essence of what this means for them and part of hearing children. If you allow me to conclude the excellencies, I would like to mention some of the points that were contained in my report, the report of my mission to Afghanistan in 2019, which was, I must emphasize, made possible thanks to the exceptional and extensive collaboration and assistance of the government of Afghanistan and its national and regional representatives and officials. I pointed out that despite the undoubted progress made in your country, and we have to acknowledge also the numerous challenges we all know exist here, sign language is still not used as a medium of instruction. Or even, I think we have to admit this also, it's not even generally taught in the schools for deaf and hard of hearing children. Instead, students tend to be trained in lip reading and articulation in spoken language. This is fine, but sign language education should be a priority. is not consistent with what most research suggests is needed in education for the best results, for the best interests of children, and the way to learn more most effectively and progress in life of society. There are other challenges in campus study. One of them is that for most public services, there remains a very severe shortage of trained teaching staff for sign languages, and especially, as many of you, perhaps all of you should know, especially outside of Michigan. There are positive elements, of course, in my report, including that Article 3 of the 2008 law on rights of and guarantees for persons with disabilities. This legislation obliges the government to provide sign language interpretation in areas of education and healthcare, in court proceedings, in the provision of state and municipal services and other areas, with the intent, the purpose of protecting and promoting the rights of persons with disabilities. The law also obliges the government to provide training for sign language interpreters, teachers, and speech, and to ensure the inclusion of sign language in the media. We all know that there are challenges there, and that more needs to be done to ensure that those legal requirements are fully implemented. However, and maybe this has changed since my